Hi, everyone. I think we can give it one more minute. We're just waiting for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right. I know we have some people still joining, but we can go ahead and get started if you're ready to, Shruti.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar on anxiety in South Asian communities, featuring a discussion by Shruthi Nair. To start us off, I'd like to just give a quick introduction of myself and of South Asian Care. So, I'm Nisha Tudeen, founder and CEO of South Asian Care. As a South Asian woman with a background in health communications and advocacy, I saw firsthand the gaps in culturally responsive care, which led me to create South Asian Care. Our mission is to address cultural barriers, connect with our community to compassionate providers, and share trusted, culturally relevant health information. Beyond webinars like this one, our website offers a provider directory, educational resources, and tools to support your health journey. Thanks so much for being here, and I hope you find today's discussion informative and helpful. Now, I'd love to introduce our speaker today, Shruthi Nair. Shruti is a limited permit mental health counselor based in New York, currently practicing at Greenberg Psychological Services. As a second generation Indian American and daughter of immigrants, Shruti brings a deep personal understanding to her work with BIPOC communities, with a special focus on supporting South Asian individuals navigating the unique challenges of bicultural identity. Shruti works primarily with adults dealing with anxiety, depression, life transitions, self-esteem, chronic health conditions, and issues related to people pleasing, shame, guilt, and family dynamics. She also specializes in helping clients process intergenerational trauma and contextualize their identities within their cultural backgrounds. A passionate advocate for destigmatizing mental health in South Asian communities, Shruti regularly appears on podcast panels and speaking engagements across various organizations. She shares educational and culturally informed mental health content on Instagram and TikTok as Bold Brown Therapist, and a platform she created to empower others through representation, storytelling, and healing. Shruti lives in New York, New Jersey with her husband, loves traveling the world, and has been learning and performing Indian classical dance since the age of 4. She sounds incredible, and I'm so excited to hear from her today.
Well, thank you
Before,
so much, Scott, for that lovely introduction.
of course, and thank you so much for partnering with us to put on this incredibly informative event today. Before I pass it over to you to lead the discussion, I just wanted to quickly tell the audience throughout, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A capabilities on this webinar. And at the end, we reserve some time and we'll go through your questions and Shruti will answer them all in detail. Well, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Nishat. I really thank you so much for the lovely introduction. And also thank you for everybody who's joining here today. I'm really excited to be here today to share how anxiety often presents itself within the South Asian community. So let's move on in sharing what the objectives of this webinar will be about. So first, it's about understanding how anxiety manifests itself uniquely in South Asian clients, recognizing the cultural and religious factors that shape how anxiety is internalized or expressed. Third, it is identifying common clinical blind spots when working with South Asian individuals, which I will talk about later in this webinar, and learning culturally informed trauma responsive interventions and engagement strategies. And lastly, exploring ways to promote culturally affirming care and decolonizing clinical assumptions. And before we get started, just want to share just a few things here where I would like to say that I may not be able to speak to every unique nuance of every specific South Asian community. I'm really just hoping to just highlight some common themes and experiences many of us can relate to. And I also would like to clarify what South Asian, what defines us as a community. So I'm really using that term to refer to people whose ancestry, heritage, or cultural ties comes from the South Asian subcontinent. So the region in Southern Asia that includes the following countries, so like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and so many other countries that include that. And I also want to add that in many contexts, the South Asian identity also extends to the diaspora, so people living outside of the region, so families originating from other countries around the world like US, Canada, UK, Australia, Africa, Caribbean, and beyond. So just want to highlight that as well. And also would like to add that South Asian is an umbrella term. So there's incredible diversity within it. So across religion, language, migration history, and cultural practices. So and one more thing I want to add as well is I will also try to share my clinical and personal experiences as well if it's relevant in this webinar. So that being said, I want to shed light on some of the South Asian sort of demographics. First, I want to talk about a bit about South Asians, particularly foreign-born individuals living in the US specifically. Where they're more commonly perceive mental illness through social or family-based frameworks than a Western sort of framework. So, for example, certain South Asian individuals may tend to understand their anxiety as a result of like poor social support more than, for example, a neurochemical imbalance within the brain, for example. On the contrary, certain South Asians with greater degrees of acculturation may identify with Western diagnostic models that focus on biological mechanisms and are more individualistic in nature. So considering this likely significant interaction between social issues and mental health among the South Asian community is an important one that I really want to highlight today. So let's move on to starting with just some numbers here. So in the US-based data, about 1 in 5 South Asians reported experiencing a mood or anxiety disorder in their lifetime. So that means that if you look around this room or imagine a South Asian friend group or a family, chances are someone you know has lived through this, whether you are aware of it or not. So that's an important statistic that I really want to share with you all. Secondly, I want to also address the underutilization of mental health services. So this is a bit concerning because when South Asians are diagnosed, mental health service use is much lower compared to the general population, specifically in the US. Among foreign-born South Asians, only about 23% sought help in the past year. And for US-born South Asians, that number is higher, but still low at 40%. So even in cases where someone knows they're struggling and has a diagnosis, most are not accessing therapy or counseling, and we'll speak later on why that's the case. Lastly, I want to also address the gender factors and some just some statistics around what the research shows around South Asian women and also South Asian men accessing mental health care. So the research actually shows that South Asian women, especially, again, born in the US, often report higher psychological distress. So one of the strongest predictors is family cultural conflict. So the push and pull between heritage cultural values and mainstream Western values. So this could look like disagreements around career choices, dating, marriage expectations, or even lifestyle differences. So when these conflicts go unresolved, they can actually fuel anxiety and strained family relationships. On the other side, South Asian American men, mental health challenges are often compounded by cultural stigma around emotional vulnerability, and the pressure to be primary financial providers. So these factors can really discourage help-seeking behaviors, meaning distress may go unrecognized or untreated for longer periods. So men may also face unique forms of family cultural conflict, such as navigating these traditional masculinity ideals while adapting to more Western norms. So this can create additional stress and identity struggles. So you might be asking, why does this all matter? Well, the combination of high distress, low help seeking, and strong cultural stigma means that many South Asians suffer in silence. So in our communities, topics like mental illness are often labeled as weakness or a private family matter, which makes reaching out for support even harder. So let's move on to the next slide. So I want to address what is anxiety, which is what this whole webinar is all about. So first, I want to start off defining it in more clinical terms, and then I will move on to speaking about it in more everyday terms. So according to the DSM-5, which is just a manual that us as therapists use to aid in diagnosis of folks who come into the clinic, in order to provide a diagnosis of anxiety for an individual, they must hold on to excessive anxiety and worry, so apprehensive expectation occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. So this is more of the clinical terms. So I will break it down into more everyday language and how this shows up. So I often say anxiety isn't just being about, it's not just being worried in quotes. It is actually your body and your mind's way of trying to protect you even when there's no real danger. So a great analogy is think of like a smoke alarm that's gone a little too sensitive and it goes off not just for fires, but for burnt toast, for example. That is what anxiety, that's what your nervous system does. So anxiety impacts your mind, your body, and your behavior. So in your mind, anxiety might sound like racing thoughts, overthinking, playing out what if scenarios. In your body, it can show up as racing heart rate, tense muscles, upset stomach, feeling restless. And third, in your behavior, it might lead you to avoid things, double check everything, or always, always, excuse me, plan for the worst. So I also want to stress that some anxiety is normal. It can motivate us, it can keep us safe. But when it's constant, overwhelming, feeling as if it is happening every day, feeling overwhelmed and gets in the way of daily life, that is when it's more than just stress and probably will need to be addressed. I also want to address, in addition to this, often anxiety is sometimes confused with fear. And I just want to make that distinction. I often say fear and anxiety are like cousins. So they're related, but they're not the same. So fear is actually your body's reaction to a real present danger. It is often the trigger is an actual threat in the environment. The function is really to protect you from immediate harm, and the resolution of fear is it ends when danger is gone. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more future oriented. You are anticipating um, a perceived threat, and the function of it is you're preparing for a potential danger, and the resolution of it is it kind of keeps going even when nothing's wrong. So just to summarize, I just want to emphasize that anxiety isn't a sign something's wrong with you. It's just a sign your body is doing its job. So it is your built-in alarm system designed to keep you safe. And I often say that everyone experiences it in some form because it's part of being human. So anxiety helped our ancestors survive, alerting them to danger. And in modern life, the same alarm can go off for work deadlines, relationship challenges, or family pressures. And third, it only becomes a problem when the alarm won't turn off or keeps going off for things that aren't actually dangerous. So we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I just want to share with you all the just different types of anxiety disorders that I see in my practice. And this is not a exhaustive list. These are just some disorders that I tend to see in individuals very commonly. And I think it can be helpful for you all to just build some awareness around these conditions. So first is generalized anxiety disorder. So what it feels like is constant worry about many things. So there's no pinpoint like one thing that you're really worried about. Maybe you're worried about family expectations, career, health, what elders might say, even when there's no clear reason to worry. And common signs of this disorder is like trouble sleeping because your mind is racing, about your future or marriage prospects, muscle tension from holding in onto stress, restlessness, difficulty focusing at work or school, what if thinking like, what if I disappoint my parents, or what if I don't get married on time? Panic disorder is this sudden, overwhelming panic attack. So maybe while stuck in a crowded family event or during a high pressure moment like a wedding or an exam, and it just seems to come out of nowhere. So often I've seen folks who come and see me, they have gone to the ER feeling as if because the sensations are so intense in their body that they sometimes feel like, oh my gosh, like this is a real medical condition, even though it's not. So common signs can be like heavy breathing, dizziness, sweating, fear that something terrible is about to happen. So the question of what if I faint or lose control in front of everyone? These are just some thoughts upon someone who holds or who have a panic disorder. Agoraphobia is just a fear of leaving the safety of the home or trusted family spaces because you worry about having a panic attack or being judged in public. So again, common signs are just avoiding crowded places. And next one is the specific phobia. So like things like needles and flying to visit relatives abroad sometimes, or even certain animals like dogs, snakes, things like that. So it's this immediate anxiety. There's a specific trigger that leads to these intense, overwhelming emotions. Social anxiety is a very common one that I see in my practice. So it often feels like this fear of embarrassment or judgment in social situations, such as speaking up during a family gathering or performing religious rituals in front of others or meeting your partner's family, for example. So, and again, common signs is like avoiding public speaking sometimes, feeling physically uncomfortable or overthinking how others see you. And then lastly is the separation anxiety disorder. So again, it's often you tend to see this in children. So it's about this worry about being apart from parents, children, or close family members. And then lastly, selective mutism, again, commonly seen in children, being able to speak comfortably at home, but unable to speak in certain settings. With this one, it's just being mindful that often South Asians, we tend to speak one language at home and then speak another language at school or outside the home. So that's just something to keep in mind. And often, I would say that South Asians, this diagnosis is placed onto them, but it's just being mindful of that, of what exactly is influencing the behavior. So the next slide, please. So I always say anxiety loves company. So it often I say that it loves company, but that company can sometimes make symptoms feel heavier, more complicated, and hard to untangle. So we, in the therapy world at least, we use this term called comorbidity. It's just a clinical word for when two or more health conditions, mental health conditions, occur together. So with anxiety, this can mean another mental health condition or a physical health condition or even a sleep disorder. So when we only treat the anxiety without addressing the other piece, it's like trying to fix a leaky pipe while ignoring the flood in the next room, and you will keep feeling stuck. So the most common pairing that I have seen in my work is anxiety and depression. They often feed into each other. So anxiety keeps you on edge, depression just drains your energy. And the two together can make daily life feel really exhausting. We also see anxiety alongside other mental health conditions like OCD, which is intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors, or PTSD, which is trauma responses and being hypervigilant due to your past. And eating disorders is another one. So often anxiety is sometimes hidden behind the dieting, the fasting, or control over food. And lastly, substance use. So sometimes alcohol or other substances are used to take the edge off and sometimes can lead into more unhealthy coping mechanism to manage the anxiety. So, and then lastly, in our community, these comorbidities often hide in plain sight. So, depression might look like constant headaches, body aches, fatigue, not sadness. OCD symptoms might be masked as being extra religious or very particular about cleanliness. Alcohol misuse and often either in women or men is sometimes normalized at weddings or parties, but not acknowledged as a coping mechanism. And because of the stigma, we might call it tension, we might call it overthinking, instead of naming it as anxiety or depression or for what it is. And the next thing I also want to mention is the physical health comorbidities that coincide with anxiety. So I say that anxiety is not just in your head, it impacts the body. How so? Well, it can show up as chronic pain, like migraines or backaches. It can show up as often folks have inflammatory bowel syndrome and other gut issues, heart conditions, especially with high stress, or even thyroid disorders, more common in South Asian women. And sometimes the physical symptoms lead people to see a doctor first without a mental health conversation, and the root cause just gets missed. And then lastly, sleep disorders. So anxiety can make sleep nearly impossible, and poor sleep makes anxiety worse. So things like insomnia, so lying awake thinking about family responsibilities, marriage pressure, sleep apnea is another form of it. And I won't get into the specifics of that, but commonly coincide when anxiety is also present. So you might be asking, why does this matter? So if we only treat anxiety, but the depression, the chronic pain, the sleep problems are just still there, and we are not looking at the individual holistically, progress will feel slow. So this is why therapy sometimes involves working alongside your doctor, or a therapist, psychiatrist, dietitian. So we address the whole picture and not just one part. So the bottom line is anxiety is rarely an only child. It usually has siblings. So the more we recognize and address these comorbidities, the more we set ourselves up for real lasting healing. So I kind of want to move on to how anxiety presents in South Asian communities. So how does this show up? So anxiety doesn't always look the same for everyone. And as you may already know, cultural factors shape how people experience and express it. So let's walk through some common ways anxiety can show up in our community. So the first is somatic symptoms, physical discomfort. So many South Asians, we don't talk openly about feeling anxious or stressed. Sometimes because mental health is still stigmatized in our communities. And instead, anxiety often comes out as physical symptoms like headaches, stomach pain, feeling tired all the time. So people might visit the doctor over and over without finding a clear medical cause, but it's actually anxiety talking through the body. So that's the first way it can show up. Second is high functioning overachievement. So you know how there's often this pressure maybe to excel in school, get a great job, and make the family proud. And I'm not saying I think those are really beautiful things. And there's a lot of merit in it. However, anxiety can show up as this constant push to perform perfectly, even when you're overwhelmed inside. So many of us are just hustling hard, looking like we have it all together on the outside, but inside we're anxious and just exhausted, which means that it is not sustainable in the long run. So it's really trying to work through what are some of the beliefs that folks are holding on to that's making it more difficult. Third, perfectionism and people pleasing. So there's also this big fear of disappointing family or community. South Asians, we come from a very collectivistic culture and really cherish those bonds, really cherish those relationships, and really want our loved ones and the people who are close to us to support us and to agree with us at all times. However, this can lead to perfectionism, and it's like this quote that I always that often I hear in my practice is if I'm not perfect, I'm letting everyone down. A very black and white thinking. And alongside that is a strong desire to keep everyone else happy, which means sometimes ignoring your own needs and feelings. And this combination can cause a lot of stress and anxiety that we keep bottled up. Fourth, irritability or emotional shutdown. So, because many of us don't feel safe talking about anxiety, it might come out as irritability or snapping at others. Or sometimes people just shut down emotionally just to protect themselves. And families might not realize these behaviors are actually signs of anxiety. And instead, it can cause misunderstandings and distance within the family system. Fifth, avoidance and control. So, anxiety can make us avoid certain situations like difficult family talks or big life decisions because they feel too scary. So, at the same time, we might try to control every other part of life, like our routines, how we present ourselves to feel safer. And so, this push and pull between avoidance and control is a way to cope with the fear of uncertainty. Sixth, spiritual or cultural interpretation. So, in many South Asian households, anxiety might be seen through spiritual ideas like karma or fate. People might think it's a test from God or the result of past deeds and turn to prayer or rituals for comfort instead of therapy. And I want to stress this that while spirituality can be very helpful, sometimes it also keeps people from getting the mental health care they need. So it's more about trying to merge it together, merging mental health, seeking out mental health support with spirituality and honoring the cultural beliefs that align with you. Seventh is family dynamics and silence. So finally, family is huge in South Asian culture, as maybe many of you have experienced and are or also align with. And so, but anxiety is often kept quiet to avoid bringing shame or burdening others. So this silence makes it hard to talk about what's really going on and can leave people feeling very alone, even when they're surrounded by family. So just very quickly, just want to quickly address shame and guilt because without addressing that, we have not gotten a full picture of how anxiety shows up. So, as I said earlier, South Asian cultures are collectivistic. So, identity and worth are tied to family, reputation, and community rather than just the individual. So, this means that guilt is often about letting down the family or breaking a cultural norm, and shame is about what others will think and the fear of being seen as less than or dishonorable. So, what are some examples of this? So, shame can sound like this. If people know I'm struggling with mental health, they'll think I'm weak. I'll bring dishonor to my family. Guilt can sound like this. I should not have talked back to my parents. I hurt their feelings and disrespected them. So you might be wondering, how does this tie into our conversation about anxiety within our community? Well, shame and guilt are chronic. They become constant, I like to say, mental background noise, triggering anxiety in three key ways. First, hypervigilance to judgment. So always scanning for whether others are approving, gossiping, or disapproving leads to social anxiety, overthinking, and avoidance. Second, fear of making mistakes. So mistakes aren't just errors. They feel like proof you're unworthy or ungrateful. And it also creates performance anxiety in academics, career, and relationships. And lastly, third, suppressed authenticity. So, to avoid bringing shame or guilt, many South Asians hide feelings, opinions, or life choices. So, this disconnect from self fuels anxiety, physical symptoms, heart racing, and burnout. So, So overall, anxiety might not always look like what we expect. It can be physical pain, it could be silence, it could be perfectionism, or spiritual struggles. So understanding these unique ways on how anxiety shows up can help us support each other better and encourage just more open conversations about mental health. So now we're going to actually move on to talking about cultural beliefs that mask anxiety. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's so many, but these are just some that are very common within our community and really fuel anxiety. And I'm just going to go over just a few of them and just describe them on how that aligns with anxiety. So first, it is you have to be strong. No one wants to hear complaints. So for this one, maybe from a young age, many of us hear things like, oh, like don't make a big deal or stop overthinking. And showing anxiety or sadness can feel like letting your family down or being weak. So instead, we just bottle it up and keep going. And that can really worsen anxiety. Second, mental health is not a real illness, it's just stress. If you say you're anxious or overwhelmed, family members might say, oh, it's just in your head, or everyone feels stressed, you're fine. This makes it hard to take your feelings seriously and ask for professional help. Third, family reputation is everything. Don't air dirty laundry. So you might be worrying about what will people say often stops people from sharing struggles. So talking about anxiety might feel like bringing shame to your whole family. So many actually stay silent to protect their loved one's honor. Fourth, put family and others first. Your needs come last. So in our culture, personal feelings often get pushed aside for family responsibilities. Prioritizing your mental health can feel selfish. So you keep your anxiety hidden while trying to please everyone. Fifth, if you work hard and succeed, everything will be okay. There's a pressure to prove your worth by excelling in school or work. So even if you're anxious, you push harder to avoid disappointing your parents or community. But this can actually make anxiety worse. And sixth, spiritual or religious explanations come first. So instead of therapy, many try prayer, rituals, spiritual healing first, because that feels familiar and safe. And sometimes anxiety is seen as a test of fate or karma, which can delay getting mental health support. So I often share how think about how these collectivistic beliefs and ideals are really rooted in such a beautiful tradition. However, it's also about how we can intersect our any individualistic beliefs that we might be holding on to and tie it back to the collectivistic roots. So what do I mean by that? That can mean by framing, for example, taking care of yourself, like self-care, not a word that we tend to use so much in family gatherings, or often a lot of our, especially our parents' generation, might be puzzled. They might be like, what is that? Like, what does that mean? And so often it is about framing how taking care of yourself, giving yourself some time for yourself, building the energy that is required to be present with your family members is truly what the collectivistic ideal is all about. It's about bringing the family together, being present with family, and really enjoying each other's presence and also time. And so ignoring yourself in the picture perhaps might lead to more distance. Perhaps it might lead to more resentment being built. And that I'm gonna say that it really question those thoughts, really question those beliefs, right? Of hey, that maybe it is about giving myself some self-respect. So I can foster my family relationships. I can foster my friendships. So that being said, in short, these beliefs make it tough to admit anxiety. But I just want to say you're not alone. Understanding these cultural pressures helps us find new ways to talk about mental health that feel safe and real for you. So now I want to move on and talk about family and generational expectations. So I first actually want to talk about something called intergenerational trauma, because intergenerational trauma and anxiety can be linked together. So you might be wondering, what is intergenerational trauma? How does that tie into family and generational expectations? So I'm going to define it, and hopefully many of you will have a good picture and a good understanding of how that align with anxiety. So intergenerational trauma is the emotional and psychological pain passed down from one generation to the next. So in many South Asian families, this trauma often comes from the difficult experiences our parents or grandparents face, like immigration struggles, discrimination, sometimes maybe war, poverty, or strict cultural expectations. So even if the younger generation did not directly experience these hardships, the impact still shows up in our lives today. So I'll share with you all just some examples on how that's the case. So, for example, parents who live through hardship from their past might be very protective, controlling, or strict, which can create anxiety in their children who feel pressure to live up to those sacrifices. Another example would be families may avoid talking about mental health or emotional pain because previous generations had to stay strong. They had to survive. That was the priority for that generation, which leaves younger people feeling isolated or confused about their own feelings. A third example, the unresolved trauma might show up as worry, fear of failure, or difficulty trusting others, even when there's no immediate threat. And sometimes this trauma influences family dynamics like silence around conflict, emotional distance, or high expectations, all which can increase anxiety. So the good news is that recognizing intergenerational trauma helps us understand where some of our anxiety comes from. So therapy can be a place, not the only place, I would add, and we'll speak about some resources later on, that it can be one of a few places to unpack these patterns, heal old wounds, and build new ways to cope and honor our roots while supporting mental health. So I just want to share with you all just a few expectations that our South Asian families tend to hold. And without them, without addressing them and talking about them, again, I always say we're not looking at anxiety in a very holistic way. First is sacrifice and duty. So think about your parents or grandparents who moved here, sometimes leaving behind their whole lives. They worked long hours, faced challenges, all to give us better opportunities. So because of that, we often feel like we owe it to them to succeed, follow the path they set, even if deep down we want something different. Expectation. Second, academic and career pressure. How many times have you heard, you need to become a doctor or an engineer? Like it is written in stone. Or maybe relatives ask, when will you get a good job? Success isn't just about us, it's about making the whole family proud. And that pressure can make us anxious about disappointing each and every family member. Third, balancing individual desires with family needs. Imagine wanting to study art, start your own business, but your family expects you to go into medicine or law, or wanting to date someone your family doesn't approve of. It's like being stuck between two worlds, wanting to honor your family, but also live your own life. And that tug of war can feel exhausting. Fourth, respect, obedience, and privacy. In many homes, questioning your parents feels like disrespect. Talking about family problems outside is taboo. So when you're struggling with anxiety, for example, you might just keep it hidden. And the silence can make us feel really alone in our emotions. And that can really worsen the severity of the anxiousness that we might be experiencing. Fifth, marriage and relationships as collective matters. Marriage is huge, and it's not just about you and your partner. Your parents, your aunties, your uncles, even community members often get involved. So maybe you feel pressure to marry on time, in quotes, or to someone from the same religion, community. And if your heart says no, that can create a lot of stress. Sixth, generational differences. So your parents might expect you to follow their traditions while you're growing up balancing those with American or Western values like independence and self-expression. And this sometimes leads to clashes, like wanting to live on your own or talk openly about mental health, but your family isn't used to that. It's tough, but very common. So these expectations can create pressure, guilt, and anxiety. But remember, again, that you're not alone in this. And again, therapy can be a safe space to talk about these feelings and figure out how to respect your family while also being true to yourself. So now I just very briefly just want to move on and talk about phrases often used instead of I have anxiety. Our parents' generation often they don't know they don't have the language to communicate mental health or how to express it. And as a daughter of immigrants, and as someone who grew up, like did not for many, many years, did not have the language on how to bring it up or how to say I have anxiety. So these phrases often come up in conversation because of stigma around mental health, limited vocabulary about emotions, or cultural preferences for describing physical symptoms. So I just listed just a few common ones, like I'm just tired, I have a lot on my plate, I have a headache, I can't sleep, but that's normal, right? Like asking those questions are just ways that phrases we tend to use instead of saying I have anxiety due to the stigma. So let's move on and talk about the impact of avoiding anxiety. So the diagram that you see on the slide is a really good depiction of what it means when every time the anxiety sort of overpowers you. So as you can see, you avoid it, you get a short-term relief, so it feels pretty good in the beginning. However, you start growing the anxiety. So it's actually long-term anxiety growth, and the cycle continues. So you feel more anxious, and as you become more and more anxious, it becomes a bigger hurdle to overcome. So, in many South Asian families, anxiety and mental health struggles are often avoided and not talked about openly. So this avoidance happens for many reasons. Stigma is one, fear of shame, or wanting to protect the family's reputation. But avoiding anxiety can actually make things harder in the long run, as I just mentioned earlier. But here's how. First, anxiety gets louder when we avoid it. So we're taught to just ignore it, tough it out. But avoiding anxiety triggers like family conflict, social events, career risks actually makes the anxiety grow louder. Two, missing out on opportunities feels like letting family down. Third, physical symptoms are real but misunderstood. Fourth, reinforces we don't talk about feelings. We don't talk about feelings, so avoidance feeds into the cultural norm of silence around mental health. By not addressing anxiety openly, it strengthens stigma and isolation. And fifth, pressure to protect family honor just adds to the burden. And this increases shame and loneliness, and you might feel like you're carrying this burden alone to protect this reputation. So as I want to move on now to talk about more practical strategies on how to manage anxiety. So we just laid out what is anxiety, how it shows up, the beliefs, the nuances, more or less, that makes challenging it or addressing it a big hurdle to jump. So let's talk about something called, I like to call it short-term ways, strategies for managing anxiety. So these strategies that I've listed on this slide are very effective. However, I don't view it as means of healing yourself from the inside and out. And when I talk about healing, I always say, we're not looking for perfection. You may never achieve perfection. It just doesn't exist. But it's more about going a little deeper, going under the surface, and addressing those attachment wounds, which I'll talk about in terms of long-term strategies for managing anxiety. So that being said, what are some of these short-term strategies? So first is breath work and grounding techniques. So I tend to share this with folks who I see in my practice all the time. And anecdotally, they have been really loving it as a tool to help navigate anxiety. So first, something I like to call the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. So you just use your five senses to ground yourself. So you just name five things you see, four things you feel, three things you hear, two things you smell, and one thing you taste. And you can do that anywhere, and nobody really needs to know that you're doing it. And you're going to feel a lot more regulated. Does this work for everyone? Maybe not, but it is an effective tool to try. Second, something I like to call boxed breathing. So you breathe in for 4 seconds. So you just take a deep breath in and you just hold it for 4 seconds and you breathe out for four and you hold it again and you repeat this to calm your nervous system. Second, affirmations that reduce guilt. So again, these are just means to manage it in the moment. It doesn't hit the core, as I said earlier. These are just small ways to make tweaks in your life that isn't um, so big. So first, some affirmations I like to share with folks is I can care for myself without being selfish. Second is taking time to rest helps me be my best for my family. And third, my needs matter just as much as others. Third, movement and mindfulness. So trying gentle yoga or stretching to release tension. Go for mindful walks outside. Use maybe dancing if that is something in your practice to reconnect with joy and your body's energy. Um, Fourth, reconnect with culture. As I said earlier, therapy is not about ignoring culture or dismissing it. It's about trying to implement it and recognize what you align with. So maybe it is cooking a favorite family recipe to feel connected, nourished. Listen to maybe some music in your native language or from your cultural background. Practice a prayer that brings comfort and calmness. And lastly, journaling prompts are a great way to reflect, to bring awareness. The more awareness you have, the easier it is to make changes. So some prompts I like to ask are things such as the following. What am I afraid will happen if I rest? Where did I learn to hide my feelings? Or how can I show kindness to myself today? So sometimes gratitude exercises when you wake up right in the morning can really set the tone for the remainder of the day. So again, all these tools I mentioned can help you create moments of calmness, self-compassion, and cultural connection in your daily life. So now let's move on to some long-term solutions to anxiety. So in my practice, I tend to use three different types of therapeutic modalities to scratch under the surface for folks who struggle with anxiety. The first one is internal family systems. So this is just a fancy word to share to basically describe that we all, us as humans, are made up of so many parts, and sometimes we just don't have a great relationship with, such as the anxious part of us, right? Sometimes we say things like, "Oh, I wish I get rid of this thing." As I said earlier, there's a purpose to it. So what IFS does is it addresses and creates and guides folks to create a relationship. So how does this work? Well, first, identify your parts. Understand each part's role. Where did it come from? Where did the worried part come from? Where did the perfectionistic part come from? The critic, the protector part. Two, develop self-leadership. Cultivate yourself. The self includes the calmness, the compassion, the curious core sense of you, and that can listen and lead your parts without judgment. Unburden those painful beliefs. Work with your parts to release burden and practice regular check-ins. So make it a habit to check in with your parts daily, noticing how they feel, if any need attention or reassurance. So IFS provides a long-term approach to anxiety by helping you build this internal connection, compassion, and balance. Second type of therapeutic modality that really addresses these long-term concerns on how anxiety shows up is EMDR work. So EMDR, again, a fancy word to basically describe how your brain, it's this belief that your brain reprocesses difficult memories from your past that may be triggering ongoing anxiety, like childhood pressures, family conflicts. So we want to access it now in the present in a way that isn't disturbing as much. So it is not talk therapy. It's actually a very somatic way of handling and managing anxiety. So it's about calming your nervous system, using some bilateral stimulation, using tapping to help calm yourself down. And so EMDR is a powerful long-term path to rewire your brain's response to stress and anxiety. And especially, even though it is the gold standard for trauma, it is very helpful when anxiety is tied to cultural and family experiences. Lastly, attachment-based therapy. As I said many times in our webinar today, that we're a collectivistic culture, which means we care so much about our relationships. So we want to understand what are our attachment styles within our families. And that might mean understanding early relationship patterns, repairing relationship wounds, building secure attachments, learning healthy boundaries, not a vocabulary we use in our community. So it's about learning how to communicate that, developing emotional regulation skills, and integrating cultural and family context. So, why combine all of this? Well, IFS kind of fosters the self-compassion and internal understanding, and EMDR helps heal the nervous system. So, putting this all together allows folks to really heal from within, and also gain some coping strategies that they can do on a daily basis to help manage the anxiety levels. So now I want to move on to how do we communicate this? How do we communicate anxiety or just mental health in general with family members? And if I would say this would be the biggest takeaway, something you can take with you after this webinar. Before I go into the steps, there's one thing I want to say before you even decide to even practice this. It is grieving the reality that some family members may never understand. So you might be thinking, well, I thought the whole goal is to make them understand, for them to agree with me. Well, we can only control our own emotions and how we address it. We can't really control another family member's emotions, thoughts, reactions. All we can do is how do we handle that? How do we manage that? And so I'll give you a few tips and suggestions on that. But that being said, how do we grieve this reality? Well, first, recognize the cultural context. So South Asian families have strong cultural values around privacy, strength, and family reputation. So these can make it very hard for members to understand or talk openly. Two, allow yourself to feel the grief. It's okay to feel sadness. It's okay to feel disappointment, and it's okay to feel anger. That even anger that your experience might not be fully seen or validated by your family. This is a real loss, and the loss of the understanding and support that you deserve. Separate your worth from their understanding. Not being understood doesn't mean your feelings are any less valid. Your mental health journey is important, regardless of whether others fully grasp it. Fourth, create your own support system. If family support feels limited, it's okay and necessary to build support elsewhere through friends, therapists, or even community groups who understand your experience. And fifth, practice self-compassion. Be gentle with yourself. Grieving this reality takes time, and it is a process, and your feelings are valid, and you deserve kindness. So let's jump into, before we wrap up our webinar today, let's jump into these steps. And again, just want to say that these steps are not 1, 2, 3 always when in reality, but it could be a nice way to just start learning and the language behind it. So first, start by acknowledging your family members' intentions. This one might be hard. You might have to dig a little deeper, but it can sound like this. For example, say something like, I know you want me to be okay, and that's why you check in so much. This lets them know you appreciate their care, even if it feels overwhelming sometimes. Next, express how you feel without blaming. Using and instead of but is a very small but powerful change. You might say, and sometimes I feel more anxious when I'm constantly reminded to just be strong. This keeps the conversation calm and less defensive. Third, offer a clear ask about what would actually help you. So for example, it helps when you just listen without giving it advice right away, or I feel more supported when you let me talk without trying to fix it. And next, clarify misunderstandings or assumptions. So they know you still respect them. You could say, this doesn't mean I don't respect you. I just need space to manage things my way too. Next, name what you would like moving forward. Can we have check-ins where I can share how I'm feeling, even if it's not always positive? Or you can say, is it okay if I bring up X or if I bring up Y? And so lastly, you want to invite them to collaborate. So you might say, would you be open to learning more about what I'm going through? Or do you think this is fair? So inviting that collaboration is essential. Again, as I said earlier, it doesn't always happen one, two, three. Sometimes it's about being mindful of when you implement these conversations with your family members. It's also about sometimes I usually recommend folks to write it down because as South Asians, we didn't learn this language. Sometimes our mouths don't even have trouble even saying it sometimes or even believing it. So it's also about first writing it down and also saying it out loud as well, or just role playing it either with your therapist or just someone within your community who you trust, a friend or whoever you find to be supportive. So I want to move on to the next slide, which is about when and how to seek support. So when is it time that, how do I know like my anxiety is overpowering me? Well, anxiety, sadness, or stress starts to affect your daily life, such as trouble sleeping, difficulty concentrating. Sometimes physical symptoms persist without a medical cause, like headaches, stomach aches, chronic fatigue, that may be linked to emotional distress. So you went to so many doctors, the doctors are saying there's no medical cause, there's no medical condition. That might be a moment for you to ask yourself, like, is it a mental health concern? And I'm not saying self-diagnose. That is just a disclaimer. Don't do that. It's more about just seeking the professional help that you might need. And these are just some telltale signs. Third, when feelings of guilt, shame, or pressure becomes overwhelming and start to impact your happiness or relationships. Next is when you notice unhealthy coping patterns like substance use, avoidance, or self-criticism. Or lastly, if you're struggling with trauma, grief, identity conflicts related to your cultural family experiences. Next, what I want to address is how to seek support. So, how do we do that? Well, normalize therapy first as self-care, not weakness. Understand that seeking help is a very brave step and not a sign of failure or weakness. Two, look for culturally competent therapists. So, find therapists who understand the South Asian nuances, the family dynamics, the stigma. This can make therapy feel safer and more relevant. Third, start small and safe. So, maybe therapy is not the answer for you. That feels like a big step. Totally fine. Consider talking to a trusted friend, maybe, or a community leader, or a mental health professional. So whatever you are willing to do is totally fine as long as you kind of seek that support. Fourth, bring cultural practices into healing, combining therapy with spiritual or cultural practices you value, like prayer, meditation, can support your mental health journey. And fifth, communicate your needs clearly. As I talked about, just some tips and suggestions on how to communicate that, just practicing that can be very helpful. And using that clear, respectful language can help them understand and set boundaries if needed. And again, you don't have to use the term boundaries if that feels like a little bit daunting, a little bit scary. You can use whatever language you want. And lastly, therapy is more than crisis care. So think of therapy like regular health checkups, not only when something's broken, but to keep your mind healthy, reflect on life, and prevent problems from growing. And lastly, In one more thing I want to add in terms of explaining therapy to hesitant family members is I often, in my own experience and something I share in my clinical practice, is using simple metaphors to make therapy relatable. So I often share these little quotes like therapy is like going to the gym for your mind, or it's like having a coach, or mental health is like physical health. You wouldn't wait until you're seriously sick to see a doctor. So therapy helps prevent mental health problems before they get worse. So again, some things to think about. So lastly, to close out our webinar, just some final thoughts and just some call to action. Just to summarize, just want to say anxiety is a very real and common experience, and remember that healing is not about rejecting your culture or family. It's about finding balance, compassion, and healthier ways to live authentically. So I just want to say you're not alone, you're not broken. And I also want to say as well that if you take away anything from this webinar, it's just taking one step today, whatever step you want to take, whether it is starting the conversation, whether it's with yourself, your family, or your community, open the door to honest dialogue about mental health. Maybe that feels too scary. Totally makes sense. It's a lot. It's a lot to overcome. So maybe it's about finding a peer group or a trusted friend. Or if you're up for it and ready, it's maybe seeking professional help from a therapist, for example. Or it might be just simply just practicing self-compassion. Give yourself permission to rest and feel and heal without guilt, because you just didn't know how to do that for so long. And then lastly, maybe it's about bookmarking a resource that I have added to on these slides, or maybe it's just about reflect on what you learned today. So what is that one thing that you were surprised about or you didn't know? And maybe just share it with a friend. And let's spread more awareness around mental health. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening. Just want to say if you want to connect with me, I have all my details here, my email, my website. Follow me on Instagram. I share a lot of very helpful mental health content as well. And feel free to email me whether you have any questions or want support. And just remember, you're not alone, and let's walk this journey together. So thank you so much for listening one more time. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Shruti. That was a wonderful presentation, and I know our audience members very much appreciated it and learned a lot through that. And it's really wonderful that people like you can give these presentations and share important education into our community, which isn't always accessible or readable for everyone. So thank you again. That was really, really informative. I know we are at time, so if anyone would like to hang on, we just have a few questions. If not, this will also be recorded and posted on our YouTube in full version. So you're also welcome to go there and view that afterwards. But I will jump right in. I know a few questions that were asked throughout were answered in the discussions, but one other one, we got one question. How can someone distinguish between normal stress and an anxiety disorder?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So, I would say normal stress often isn't so as widespread. So, I often have seen that anxiety tends to be very overpowering, meaning that it impacts your relationships, it impacts just the sort of you have a lot of racing thoughts. Stress is more. There can be chronic stress for sure. However, the intensity of it isn't as extreme as anxiety. And that would be the distinction. So stress is more of like, sure, there are like headaches, which also anxiety also manifests itself in as well. But I would say that the distinction is more about the frequency and also the severity of the presentation of the outcome. So if the headache is lasting the stressor is gone and it's lasting for another few weeks without any triggers or any cause, then that's probably anxiety versus stress. If it's like I'm studying for an exam, or I'm applying for a job and I'm doing a job interview or something like that, you might feel a headache, you might have those stomach aches, but then it goes away after that trigger and that moment or that situation is gone.
Thank you. And just one other question. As someone who has been experiencing panic attacks for over a year, what is a good place to start? I'm not sure what to do, but I feel overwhelmed, especially when driving.
Ooh, so I would say a good place to start um, is really, it goes back to a lot of the sort of the mindfulness breathing techniques. They're very, very helpful for managing panic attacks. However, I would say in order to really kind of hit the root cause of panic attacks, something that I do in my practice with folks who do have panic attacks is something I like to call exposure therapy, where you're slowly sort of exposing yourself to your triggers. And that might mean we're kind of creating like a hierarchy where it's like the lowest hierarchy where it's not as triggering, and just like slowly like building the tolerance to the discomfort. And also it's also about sometimes like reframing. So I do a lot of like cognitive reframing. So reframing some of those thoughts. But in terms of that's more of like long-term care and really hit the root of that. In terms of like things that you can do immediately, it would be just like doing some breath work, or the 5 4 3 2 1 that I spoke about earlier is an excellent skill. Or sometimes something that I found is sometimes tapping. So like sometimes I share with folks that I see in my practice to sort of start tapping on their body, whatever feels good. And sometimes that also helps calm the nervous system. So I will say it's more, there's a lot more to it, but if you want to start somewhere, and some tangible tools, I would say start with some of the mindfulness practices and some of the breath work.
Thank you, Shruti. So that was all the questions we had today. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found the discussion insightful. I know I did. And thank you so much, Shruti, for partnering with us to bring this event to life and to bring important education to our community. And for everyone, we have a few other upcoming events, so please visit our website and register for those events and learn more. And also, if you'd like to get in contact with Shruti, her profile is on our directory as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Shruti. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Nishat, for having me.
Of course. All right. Bye, everyone.